Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to an active Echo tier list. Now, you might be thinking, why would I need an active Echo tier list? Don't I just use the forecast for whatever set I'm using? And, no, actually. There's quite a few situations where that's not the case, and you actually end up using something different. So, we're not going to do every single Echo, we're only going to do the ones where I think there's an actual good reason to use them under some circumstances. And so, let's get right into it. So first off, we're going to be ranking the 3 Glacio set 1-cost that deal a little bit of Glacio damage as a summon on an 8-second cooldown. Now, the reason why these are worth a consideration is actually because the active Echo, that is the 4-cost in the Glacio set, is really bad. Now, it does a decent amount of damage, but one, the animation for it is incredibly long, so it's very likely that you're going to get hit while you're using it, which obviously isn't good. And two, the fact that it's not really swap cancelable means that it's also, in a lot of situations, an actual DPS loss to even use it. This puts you in a situation where it's actually kind of worth it to just use a summon Echo that doesn't have an animation time instead of using the 4-cost. Let's actually name our tiers first. Alright, so we're gonna have Goat, very good. Feels okay to use. Usable because the alternatives aren't great. And we're gonna have not a great idea. Now, keep in mind, even the Echoes that are gonna be here, you can still use them. If I was doing an actual complete tier list, there would be another tier below for the Echoes that I'm not gonna be ranking because I just don't think they're worth considering. So, the 3 Glacio 1-cost Echoes are gonna be unusable because the alternatives aren't great. And the active Echo 4-cost is going to go in not a great idea. Now, the main issue with all of these, really, is that the current only character that actually wants the Glacio set sometimes is Ling Yang, and none of these Echoes can be used during his forte when he's in the air. They're just not usable. Like, the button becomes grayed out, you can't use them. Because you can only use these effectively once per rotation instead of 2, because you can't use it in the air, it really doesn't feel very good to use them, which is why later on we're gonna see that there's another alternative for the Glacio set that is a 3-cost. But, and we'll also get into that later on, the lack of a good active Echo can actually be enough for you not to use the Glacio set. So stick around to find out why. Next up, when it comes to 1-costs that are actually potentially worth a consideration, is going to be the Fusion Warrior. Fusion Warrior is going to go in feels okay to use for a few reasons. Reason number 1, the sets that Fusion Warrior can be a part of are the Arrow set, which has a pretty good active Echo, and then the Electro and the Fusion set, which both don't have necessarily the best options for active Echoes. And that's going to leave you in a situation where you don't lose as much from not using the alternatives, and then the Fusion Warrior can actually give you some pretty nice utility. So what it does is you transform into the Fusion Warrior to perform a counterattack. If the counterattack is successful, the cooldown time will be reduced by 70%, and you will deal 288% fusion damage. Here's what it looks like when you're actually using it in practice to get a counterattack. Can you please attack me? And as you can see, the cooldown is pretty short. Against enemies that aren't, like, insanely aggressive, you can pretty much use it on every single attack. Now, the reason why this is nice is because there's a lot of enemy attacks that are a bit harder to dodge properly or to parry. The window for the parries with the Fusion Warrior are a lot more generous than the windows for a dash. So if you know there's an attack that you're always dying to, and you're using a character that is using the Fusion set or that is using the Electro set, and you keep dying to that same attack, you can put your character on Fusion Warrior, and when you see the attack coming, you just use it to avoid the damage. The fact that it has a low cooldown if you do counterattack something also means that it can be used multiple times. It does, like, okay-ish damage. It's not the best, but it is fine. It's far from being like an insane amazing Echo, but it is definitely something that, you know, if you're doing a hologram fight that is actually giving you some trouble, it can be worth considering to help you out for that. And honestly, that's pretty much it for the 1-cost that you should be considering. The rest of the 1-costs just don't really do very much. There's some that sound like they could be useful, like the Whifflaw, for example, that if you just read the description, on a Whifflaw that triggers an air explosion, dealing damage and producing a low pressure zone. The low pressure zone continuously pulls enemies nearby towards the center for 2 seconds. Oh my god, that's crazy! And then you actually look at it in practice, and not only is the area incredibly small, but the pull strength is also incredibly small, or incredibly weak.
Hopefully this helps.
You can see how much that grouped. Now these guys are immune to grouping, but these guys aren't. This is how much they get pulled throughout the duration. It doesn't actually pull enemies in a meaningful way whatsoever. There's another thing that can kind of be useful, and that's the tic-tac. Tic-tac reduces vibration strength a little bit. The biggest issue with that is that I think that if what you care about is reducing vibration strength as much as possible, you're better off running echoes that give you concerto energy. And I guess there's only one of them that does that, and it's not available in all of the sets that tic-tac is available, but it is available in some of them. And don't worry, we'll get to the echo that gives concerto later on. Tic-tac can also be like situationally somewhat alright, but it doesn't do that much, and also turns out that right now it's bugged and doesn't actually reduce vibration strength. So that's cool. And then you've got other like utility echoes like Excarad that gives you a long like 4-ish seconds of invulnerability, which can be nice in similar situations as Fusion Warrior. Next up, we're gonna move on to some of the 3 costs that can be considered. So first off is gonna be the 3 costs in the Glacio set. Effectively, the main reason why you'd use the 3 costs in the Glacio set is because, again, the same reason why you use the 1 cost in the Glacio set, which is that the Myriad, the 4 cost, just isn't that great. Now you can use Tambourinist and Roseshroom as like fine options that do a bit of damage. Like they're also fine. They're not really better than these because usually if you're playing Glacio set, you're gonna have a lot of Glacio damage, and because these don't do Glacio damage, they're not really gonna do as much. And then the other option is the Auto Puppet Scout. The main thing about the Auto Puppet Scout is that it is also a transform, but it's a transform that is a lot less cringe to use than the Myriad. However, right, you transform into this, you do this, but it is swap cancelable, right? So if you're in combat, and this is the first swap cancelable echo that we're looking at, so let's actually explain what a swap cancel is. And this doesn't just apply to echoes, but for the purposes of an echo tier list, we'll only be talking about the ones that you do with echoes. If you use an echo that has a long animation that is a transform, you can swap into a different character during the animation and still get the echo animation on your off-field character, basically. If I use my echo and then immediately swap out, you can see the echo still does its thing. The main issue with the Auto Puppet Scout is that the reason why Myriad isn't good is because you don't want to, use the whole thing. But the thing is, you can just use the first hit of the Myriad and swap cancel that first hit, and you still get an amount of damage that is actually somewhat similar. It's a little bit less, but you do get a little bit of Glacio damage and skill damage out of it, 4% of each, and you do get some utility with the freeze. Overall, I think that the Auto Puppet Scout is honestly relatively similar to the Myriad, all things considered. Maybe if you can do some crazy stuff with the walls that it does, if it helps you like block an attack or something, maybe it's pretty good, but generally it's not really what you're looking for. And the main reason why both of these echoes are below these is because, again, right, if you look at a character like Ling Yang, who is currently the only character that really wants the ice set, you realize that Ling Yang's rotations don't really lend themselves too well to swap cancels. You want to swap into him once you have your Sanhua stuff available, right? You trigger her outro, swap into him, get his intro, use his ult, your full forte, go in the air, start bashing on the enemies, and then swap out. The thing is, when you swap out, you want to do that in the middle of your ending animation of your forte, and you're still in the air when you're doing that, which means you can't use an echo to swap out. So if you want to be using either of these echoes, you'll have to add another swap into him in the middle of your setup. And that generally doesn't feel too great to do. You're also getting less stats overall during that because it means you don't have all the buffs from 5-piece Moonlit Cloud set, from the Heron. Which means that in practice, you're generally just better off swapping into him using a non-transform echo and then using his ult. Next up, we can talk about the Heron. The Violet Heron is very similar to the Fusion Warrior, but instead of getting cooldown reduction when you trigger your parry, you get Concerto. Now, that's not very good on characters where you want to stay a little bit longer, because you only get one of them every relatively long amount of time. But if you're using it on a character where you're only swapping into them once and not staying on them for that long, it is usable still, right? You get the Concerto. The main issue is you have to end up swapping into a character at a moment where you get attacked, which won't necessarily be happening. And then if you're not getting attacked, then you don't get your value out of your Echo. It is still usable, but it's not really generally something you feel that good about using. Next up is the Geohide Saurian, which is a summon, right? Which means it has no animation. You can use it in the middle of your attack, in the middle of your combos, whatever, right? And I'm in the middle of my attack. It doesn't even cancel my attack to summon it, which means that on characters that, you know, don't really have the best options to weave in with a lot of swap cancels, this is definitely usable. However, the Fusion Echo alternatives are stronger than the Glacio Echo alternatives. I would probably rank this a little bit lower than the Glacio ones, looking at a character like Encore, for example, or Cyan, where it's definitely usable on them, but generally you're kind of better off using one of the other ones. Next up, we move into the Pog stuff. So the next 3 Chaos Echo I want to talk about is the Flautist. Flautist, like many of the other active Echoes, is a transform. That means you have to, you know, do the whole thing. Now, if you just tap it, it won't last a very long time, but you will only get 3 hits, which is something that it doesn't actually say in the description. You actually have to hold it to get all 10 hits. And if you do hold it, the animation is pretty long. However, it is swap cancelable. What makes Flautist so good is that 1, 530 motion value, that's a lot of damage. 2, 10 Concerto energy, that's a lot of energy. And 3, each hit from the Flautist also generates 0.83 resonance energy to your character that has the Echo, and half of that to the rest of your team, because that's how energy generation works in this game. If you want to know more about energy generation, you can check out the video on my main channel in which I explain the energy mechanics. What that means is that this Echo ends up actually doing a pretty good amount. It does a good damage, generates a lot of Concerto energy, and a pretty good amount of resonance energy, right? 10 hits, each 0.83, so 8.3 resonance energy from this Echo alone. Right, so you still get all of your energy even if you swap cancel it. Now, one thing to keep in mind for Flautist is you have to hold until you have fully swapped. So what I mean by that is there's a bunch of Echoes that have a different effect if you hold them and if you tap them. And for most of the other Echoes, once the game has registered that you have started to hold, you can safely stop holding and it will still do the hold effect. With Flautist, you have to make sure that you swap before you release your Echo button. Otherwise, it's just gonna register that you stopped holding, and then it's gonna stop doing the beam. What that means is that specifically, if your Flautist is on your character that's on the second slot and you're playing on mouse and keyboard, if you want to swap cancel from 2 to 1 and you want to use Flautist like that, you're gonna have to use your Q and then reach all the way over to your 1 button without releasing your Q. And so I would highly recommend, if you end up using a character with Flautist on your second or third slot, I would highly recommend rebinding your Echo button to something other than Q, so that you can like very easily reach all of your swap keys without a problem. Because that is something that I have noticed when I use Flautist. In any case, right, Flautist is really a very good Echo, and it is going to make it into the very good tier. Now, what's the problem with Flautist? What's the downsides that make it so that it doesn't make it any higher than this? Mainly, its damage is entirely single target. What that means is that in some situations you'll get all the value out of it, but in a bunch of situations, while the Flautist beam does go through the enemy, so technically it's not single target, especially considering how bad the auto-targeting is in this game, getting your beam to go through multiple enemies is gonna be rough. And most of the time, enemies aren't lined up in a nice straight line either, so it's generally not really going to happen, which means that offensively, whenever you're in a situation where there's a bunch of enemies, it's generally only going to be hitting 1, maybe 2. Which means that in the damage department, even though it has big numbers, practically it doesn't often actually do as much as you'd hope. On top of that, even though it is swap cancelable, it also does mean that you need to adapt your rotation to have a moment where you can use the Echo and then swap out. And for a lot of characters, they already have a lot of stuff they want to swap cancel, and adding one more required swap cancel in your rotation is going to make your rotation longer. So being swap cancelable is an upside, but needing to be swap canceled to be good is a downside that the summon echoes don't have because of their very, very short or non-existent animations. Next 3 costs I want to talk about. We can talk about the Cyan Feathered Heron. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think mainly, 1, the 4 cost for arrow set is actually pretty good, and 2, enemies just don't do a lot of special skills. Special skills are stuff where like their eyes glow red and then they do one of their special attacks, but a lot of the time, 1, they're kind of just gonna, like the Aix for example, it just flies away when it does its special attack, so it's hard to land this and actually interrupt it. But also, having an Echo just for that, when you actually have other really good alternatives, doesn't really do that much. Now for a Transform Echo, it does have a very short animation, which is good. But even then, even that shorter animation isn't really, I mean, it's not instant. It also often puts you in the air, which means that you're gonna have to be a little bit more vulnerable for a little bit. It is swap cancelable, but it's not necessary to swap cancel it. Overall, it's a fine Echo, but it's gonna go in the not a great idea for most of the time. You're not really considering it, but maybe towards the top of it, because if you do get to cancel the special attack, it does feel pretty good. Next up, I guess we can talk about the Rocksteady Guardian. It has a very similar upside to the Heron, which is that it can interrupt a special skill. It's also a counter, but really it's longer cooldown counter, and it's in a set that actually already has a pretty good active Echo. And then on top of that, in patch 1.1, and obviously if you don't want to see any leaks whatsoever, you can skip ahead a little bit. But in patch 1.1, we are going to get a new Spectro set Echo that has a very strong active, which is going to be probably generally better than Mourning Aix, and that's really going to reduce its value. So again, right, I might as well put it in the not a great idea tier, because like I still think there's some situations where you can consider it, but it's not really a major consideration. Next up, you have the Havoc Echoes, and for the 3 costs, honestly, none of them are worth considering. The Healing Set Echoes, I actually want to quickly talk about, because I want to quickly say that you shouldn't use them. I've seen some people say, oh, because the Chasm Guardian heals you, you get to activate the 5-piece Sonata effect of the Healing Set, which gives you 15% attack to your whole team. And like, yeah, but also, it itself is pretty ass, and there's an active Echo that does basically as much, or almost as much, as the 5-piece Echo, just by existing. So you never really want to consider this. That's gonna be it for the 3 costs, which leaves us with the 4 costs, the pièce de résistance, you know, as they say. And we are going to be looking at them holistically. And what I mean by that is there's some Echoes that are actually good enough to change what set you're using. We've already ranked the Lamp Illumin Myriad. It's the worst 4-cost Echo, maybe tied with another one. It's not very good. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet, though, is the synergy between the Bell-Borne Geochone Echo and any Transform Echoes. As far as I'm aware, it's not actually written anywhere. So if the editors would kindly zoom in on what just happened, I got hit by that, but it showed a 0 damage number. That's because Transform Echoes actually give you 50% damage reduction. If I do the same thing without using the turtle, and I just transform into the Lamp Illumin, right, I get one shot. Because this enemy does enough damage to one-shot me through 50% damage reduction. But damage reduction in this game is additive, which means that if you have 2 sources of 50% damage reduction, you're invulnerable. Which means that Transform Echoes aren't necessarily as bad as they look like at first glance if, you know, they put you in a vulnerable position. That being said, because the Lamp Illumin animation is so slow, it still doesn't really do enough damage to justify its field time. But this is something that is going to affect further Echoes. But yeah, right, so it's using the 50% damage reduction from the Bell-Borne shield and from the transformation. But I don't want to talk about the turtle just yet. For now, let's talk about the other 4-cost active echoes. So the next one is the Inferno Rider. And Inferno Rider is very interesting, because the Inferno Rider deals a pretty good amount of damage, and also it generates a pretty good amount of energy as well. Now, it is a relatively slow animation, but you can swap cancel it and still get all of the hits as soon as the cooldown appears in the bottom right of your screen on your echo cooldown. As soon as the cooldown appears, it becomes swap cancelable and you will still get all of the hits. Right? You still get all 3 hits. Now, the biggest issue with it is that it doesn't really adjust its positioning if the enemies move, which means that in practice, very often it's going to end up just missing unless you're against very stationary enemies. The first 2 hits will generally hit, but the third one will very often miss. Inferno Rider is one of those echoes where like it's very close to being really good. It is swap cancelable. It does a very good amount of damage. It generates a very good amount of energy, but the animation is just long enough that it doesn't feel the greatest to use. And its auto targeting and like lock on are just annoying enough that it's gonna miss sometimes and just feel like shit when it does. And because of that, I'm gonna put it in feels okay to use towards the top. Next up is the Electro Echoes. So both the Thundering and the Tempest Mephis. So the Thundering Mephis is a 6-hit combo where you can only really swap cancel the last hit. This echo does a very large amount of damage. It's almost 1,000 motion value. But it also has a very long animation, which makes it so that, much like the Lampy Lumen, it's just not really worth it. Now, like the Inferno Rider, the Thundering Mephis does generate a pretty good amount of energy. It can generate like around 15 energy before ER, which is, I think, the highest of any echo. But that's coming at the cost of a lot of field time. And when you're comparing it to like Inferno Rider, for example, that generates like around 12 energy, it's a little bit less, but you have to stay on field for so much less time. Now, the final hit is still swap cancelable, but by the time you get to the final hit, you've fallen asleep already. Because of that, Thundering Mephis is unfortunately just not the best. It is still usable, especially if you're more early game, if you don't have very high character levels yet, you don't have very high talent levels yet, because this motion value doesn't scale with your character level or your talent level. It does scale with all of your stats, obviously, but so does the rest of your damage. But the rest of your damage also has the additional layer of needing to be leveled up through your talent levels. So early on, if you're at talent level 3 or whatever, your damage on the rest of your stuff, on the rest of your kit, is reduced more than your damage from echoes. So echoes that do a lot of motion value by themselves gain a little bit of value, but honestly, it's not really enough. Overall, Thundering Mephis is fine. Next up, we have the Tempest Mephis, which is the better of the 2 4-cost options. Now, the Tempest Mephis is an echo that actually warrants an explanation further than what it actually says. Alright, so what it says is, transform into Tempest Mephis, perform tail swing attacks followed by a claw attack. The lightning strike summoned by the tail swing deals 102.48% electro damage each time, while the claw attack deals 175.68% electro damage. After the claw hit, you gain a buff. So, if I just use it in the air, we get the tail attack and then the claw attack. The thing is, and this is something that it doesn't say, the tail strikes, I mean, it says that it summons lightning, but what it doesn't say is that if you input the claw strike, it will stop summoning lightning. Which means that if you wait to use a claw attack, you will get more damage out of it. In practice, though, that's not actually what you're going to be doing. In practice, generally, what you're going to be doing with this echo is you're just going to pretend like the claw attack doesn't exist. You're going to use the tail attack and you're going to immediately swap out. You will get 4 hits. It's an echo that is easier to use and with slightly better AoE than the Flautist. It does generate 6.4 energy, which is okay. The damage and AoE is a little bit better, and that's really all there is to it. It's also, because you don't have to hold it, right? You just have to tap. It's a lot easier to use than the Flautist. You can swap cancel it basically frame 1. I'd say that generally, this is a bit better than Flautist in AoE, and Flautist is a little bit better than this in single target. But Tempest Mephis is still a pretty decent echo. I think I'll put it up here for the main reason that when it comes to the Electro set, you can have both a Tempest Mephis and a Flautist in your build at the same time, and you can change which one is currently in your active slot based on what you're currently fighting. Next up, the monkey. Monkey is an echo that has a medium length animation that can't be swap cancelled too early, because if you swap cancel it too early, you lose the effect. Right, you'll get the first hit, but not the second one. But you can still cancel it relatively early. You just have to wait until your first hit connects. And as long as your first hit is connected, you can swap out safely. And that's still relatively fast, right? And you'll still get both hits. It does a pretty good amount of damage. It generates a decent amount of energy. And the buff that it gives is actually very useful for Gian. On top of that, Gian's rotations lend themselves very, very well to actually being able to use your monkey right before his uptime while still getting a swap cancelled in. If you want to know more about those rotations, make sure you go check out the previous video on this channel, which was about team building, and which had a pretty lengthy section on an example rotation with the Gian 4-5 arena team. But all in all, the monkey is a pretty good echo that's a very solid all-rounder. It's going to go at the top of very good for me. Next up is the Mourning Aix. And Mourning Aix is another example of a pretty solid all-rounder. The animation for it is overall quite quick. It can be swap cancelled even earlier than the monkey can. Right? You don't have to wait for the first hit. But in exchange for that, you're getting around 6 energy instead of around 8, and you're getting a total of around 400 motion value instead of around 500. So all in all, it's kind of like the monkey, where it's an all-rounder that is pretty good at everything, but it trades some damage and energy generation for a faster swap cancel and a faster overall animation if you don't want to swap cancel it. That is enough, in my opinion, to bring it about as good as the monkey. A little bit worse, mainly because it doesn't have great users right now, and because by the time it does have a good user, and again, if you're not interested in league content whatsoever, you can skip ahead. But also you're getting, by the time it's going to have a good user, that good user will also have a better echo option. But even then, it's a pretty solid echo. Next up, we have the Havoc echoes. Let's start with the Crownless. Crownless is one of the worst echoes. It has one nice upside. Okay, so my base Havoc damage, 73.6. If I get it and dash out of it, 85.6. So you get the damage from it instantly, which is good. It's a nice upside. That also means that you can just swap cancel the first hit and still get the damage bonus. Right, you'll still get the damage bonus if you do that. Otherwise, if you're doing the full animation, the animation is incredibly long. Now you can swap cancel on the last hit, but all in all, it's just not that great. And more importantly, there's an incredible alternative in the Havoc set that is also a 4 cost that is just pretty much almost always better than Crownless. I'd say the one situation where Crownless can be better is if you're playing like solo dungeon, because if you're playing actual like a solo character, you don't have anyone to swap cancel to, then you have to go through the whole Dreamless animation and you're probably just gonna die if you do that. And if you're gonna have to dash out of an animation anyways, you'd rather dash out of an animation and get some damage bonus instead of dash out of an animation and get nothing. Next up, we have the true Havoc 4 cost, which is the Dreamless. You transform into Dreamless, you go pew 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 pew. And when you're not in combat, that's how it ends. When you are in combat, you'll then dash into the enemies. Now, Dreamless has an advantage over a lot of the other 4-cost active echoes, which is that very much like the Mourning Aix and I guess the Tempest Mephis, if you're only doing the first hit, it is swap cancelable frame 1. You can just use it and then immediately swap cancel out, and you will still get the whole thing. On top of that, it has a really good damage, and it has really good AoE. On top of that, it also generates a pretty decent amount of energy. All these things together makes it so that Dreamless really is one of the best echoes in the game, and it is going to go in the GOAT tier. But we're not done yet. We still have 3 more sets to look at. First, take a look at the Turtle. The Turtle doesn't do that much damage. It also doesn't generate that much energy. However, it's one of the echoes with the fastest animation times. And it gives you a team-wide buff that both increases your damage and reduces the damage taken. That lasts for a pretty good amount of time. All of this to say, Turtle truly is one of the better echoes. You should be using it on almost all of your teams. Turtle, very pog. However, I've come to the realization that there is a support echo that is better than the Turtle. And I don't mean that you should play it over the Turtle, because very often you're gonna end up playing both. I want to talk about the Impermanence Heron. The Impermanence Heron is honestly just insane. Not only does it give you 12% damage to the character you swap to, which is, to begin with, kind of what you'd expect out of an average, like, 4-cost additional effect. But then on top of that, it also gives you 10 resonance energy. It also gives you up to 12 hits of 55% motion value each, basically over 600 motion value. It is swap cancelable incredibly early. Each of those 12 hits is giving you 0.87 resonance energy. So you're on top of the 10 resonance energy you're gaining from the effect, you're also gaining another 10 resonance energy from the resonance energy generated by the hit, and 5 resonance energy to the rest of your team. And it's on a set that you want on almost every single team with the Moonlit Cloud set. Basically, it's really, really good. Now, I think a lot of people don't realize that you're actually supposed to hold it. And one thing that I think makes people think that it's worse than it actually is that if you don't swap cancel it and you just hold it, right, it's kind of hard to get all of the hits to actually connect with the enemies. However, if you swap cancel it, it will auto-target onto the enemy incredibly easily. Because of that, I've actually come to think that the Impermanence Heron actually makes it above Dreamless in the GOAT tier. Anyways, now we only have one Echo left, which, you know, everyone knows the attack set isn't very good, so, like, who cares, right? Wrong! This is the reason why I wanted to make this video. The Mech Abomination is really f***ing good! It's so good! Okay, so first, I wanna put an asterisk here. Currently, the Mech Abomination is bugged. The Lingering Tunes outro skill damage is not functioning correctly, and the Mech Abomination doesn't benefit from outro skill damage like it's supposed to. I am going to be talking about this with the assumption that that is something they're going to be fixing soon. At the very least, by patch 1.1. That being said, if you want to, you know, be sure, you can always go take a look at this, and most likely they're not going to remove it without fixing it. So if this is still here, you can assume that it hasn't been fixed yet. And once it's gone, you can probably safely assume that it has been fixed. The thing is, even with this bug, it's still really good. Let's explain why. If all you look at is, you know, the numbers on it, it's actually going to look somewhat underwhelming. It's around 50, and then 320, and then 160. So it's a little bit over 500 motion value, which is good, but it's not outstanding. On top of that, it's electro damage, which, if you're playing a character on the attack set, might not be the element of your carry, right? So you're not getting electro damage main stat 3 costs to boost the damage that you're getting from your active echo. On top of that, the initial hit generates 0.7 energy, and then the second hit is only 1.5, and the third hit is nothing. It's actually one of the active echoes that generates the least amount of energy in the game. However, here's what the animation for it looks like. Right, so it's a very short animation. It also can be used to interrupt an attack string. So for example, if you're playing Kalcharo, you can use the Mech Abomination to interrupt your attack string and not have to go all the way to the N4 and N5, which are pretty bad, during his ultimate. And finally, the AoE of it is massive. It's pretty trivial to get it to hit every single enemy in the room, basically. And the reality is that very often that matters a lot. Actually getting good AoE on your echoes is a really big deal because most characters don't have the best AoE on their abilities, and being able to do a decent amount of damage in AoE just from your echoes is gonna make it so you don't have to focus as much on the enemies that are on the outside, and you can focus on the tankiest target quite a bit. On top of that, if we actually group the enemies, what you're gonna see is that it has quadratic scaling, right? So it summons one little Mech Abomination for each enemy that is on the field, and after a while they will explode. But this explosion originates from every single Mech Abomination on the or Mech Waste on the field, which means if you have 5 enemies close together, this explosion will hit each enemy 5 times. On top of that, once fixed, the damage from it will be considered outro skill damage, and the 5-piece Lingering Tunes buffs outro skill damage by 60%. So this damage percent that you're losing out on from not having the right main stat on your echoes is already made up for. But then on top of that, if you are playing a character that is Electro, you're getting an additional bunch. And all of that paired with the fact that it effectively has no animation time, and by far the biggest AoE in the game. If you're only looking at like the size of the AoE, it's not that much bigger than Dreamless, but because you don't have to deal with the auto-targeting, right? It just is a very large circle with the center just being where you are. It's just really good. It is going to make it so that all in all, the Mech Abomination is going to make it above Dreamless and below Heron in my list. The one thing holding it back is the pretty low energy generation that it provides. Unfortunately, energy generation does matter a decent amount, and having lower energy generation from your Echo does mean that you're gonna maybe need to get one more roll of ER in your substats, which is not like necessarily ideal, although, and I am planning on making a video talking about stat distribution later, one more roll of ER may not be as much of a loss as you think. You look at the energy we're generating, as you can see, right? It's just a very small amount compared to the other echoes. That being said, its fast animation means that you can use it and then generate energy on other characters or on the character without having to swap. Anyways, that's gonna be it. I think I've ranked pretty much everything I wanted to rank. I do want to, in the conclusion, talk a little bit about the attack set, right? And again, I am talking about this with the assumption that they're going to actually fix and make it work how it's supposed to. People really underestimate the attack set, right? The 10% attack that you gain and then another 20% while you're on field if you stay on field. One, I think a lot of people don't know, if your model doesn't disappear, you don't lose this attack buff. So, easiest way to show it is with Kaltaro. If I swap out and I look at his stats, right, he's at 1811 attack. If I go on him and stay for the 6 seconds it takes to fully stack the set, right, we're at 1928. And if I swap out and then back in, it resets, right? However, if I swap out in the middle of a long animation and my model does not disappear before I swap back in, I triggered his outro, which gave me an attack buff. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I'll go show it against the Mech Abomination because it's thematically appropriate. And so I'm still at 1928. I shouldn't have done that. That's fine. I can just ult. Right, and I'm still 1928, and then I swap out, and then I swap back in before the animation is over, and I'm still at 1928. Alright, even though I'm swapping out, even though I'm getting my swap cancels in, I'm not losing the attack I'm gaining from the 5-piece attack set. And on top of that, I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of these characters, a lot of these carries like Altaro, have outros that do a really good chunk of damage. Now right now, like we talked about earlier, the set is bugged and doesn't properly always buff outro damage, but once it is fixed, this like almost 600 motion value is a pretty big deal. And getting 60% damage on this is a pretty big deal. If you're looking at characters that can use this set that otherwise would be using echoes that are lower in the tier list, so for example Encore, I'd say that with Encore it's kind of 50-50 which one you want to use. I think they're both viable. You will actually do more damage with the Inferno Rider and it's going to be overall better, but Encore's AoE doesn't tend to be the best, so getting some form of AoE through the mech is actually a pretty big deal in a lot of chambers. And then when you look at a character like Cisia, because she just does less damage than Encore, the damage that you get from the Echo itself is going to be a little bit more significant to her overall damage profile. And I'd say that with Cisia, you're actually generally better off using Mech Abomination. All this to say, this is my overall Echo tier list. Just because an Echo's a bit lower doesn't mean you shouldn't use it, right? Like, again, for Encore, like, you can feel good about using Inferno Rider. It feels a little clunky, but once you get used to it, it's not too bad. I would try to stay away from the ones that are lower than that, though. But yeah, that's it for the Echo tier list. Let me know if you disagree with anything. Let me know if you think that there's an Echo I'm underestimating, especially if there's something that I haven't mentioned at all that you think I should have. Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.